Okay, I'd now like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Lu Paletta, and the topic is wild presidential elections. We thought this would be a good topic in view of the election coming up, to know that there have been other wild presidential elections. Lu has had a long business career, professional career in the consumer electronics industry and financial services. She received her BA and MBA from Western Michigan University. However, her lifelong passion is also being a history buff. She has studied American presidents for 40 years. She has written books on the American presidency, first ladies, and the American election process. She's delivered 250 speeches on American history and written many articles. So please welcome our speaker, Lu Paletta.
Thank you. This year is our 59th presidential election. And yes, it probably is the wildest, although there are some others that are probably close in contention. But before we get into the elections itself, I thought it would be appropriate to explain, and here's some of them. We have Hayes, McKinley, Adams and Jefferson. Some of you remember the Dewey and the Truman, and some of the others, and very bad against Andrew Jackson. That's called the Coffin Campaign, and we'll talk about that. But how do we elect a president? So in the 1787 convention, when after the Declaration of Independence, we're still trying to figure out, there was a 14-year period between the time that we declared our independence from Britain to the time that we became the United States, that there was something called the Continental Congress. So it wasn't until 1789 that we had the first election, and they're trying to figure out how to do it. And so the Electoral College, which you're hearing about, and we'll talk about it a lot at the end, was part of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Now, some of the delegates wanted Congress to be the one to select the president, but you can imagine how that would be. These guys can't get along now. They couldn't get along back then either. And they thought that would upset the power between the three branches, which is the executive, which is the presidency, and the cabinet. You had the legislative, which is Congress and the Senate. And I probably will slip and just say Congress, meaning both set houses. And then you have the judicial. Others wanted direct popular vote. Well, that was a problem back then, which unfortunately some of the people in North Carolina are finding out right now, because there were no cell phones and you had to depend, people were living on farms, they were living outside, there weren't a lot of newspapers. And so the public may not know about a candidate. So if think about if you were in Boston, you were in Massachusetts, those people had better ways of communicating than maybe somebody down in the Carolinas or in some of the territories, and you wouldn't know who the candidates were. So they didn't like that. They thought the voters would be ill-informed. Okay, so then they finally produced the Constitution after 13 years, and they came up with a number of compromises. So James Wilson of Pennsylvania proposed a compromise is that you would elect an elector. And at the very end, I'm going to show you the ballot, those of you who have not already received your absentee ballot, but show you the ballot that you will receive at your polling place when you go in 29 days and who's on it. Okay. And so he took it from the Holy Roman Empire. An elector basically selected who was the king, okay, who was the emperor. And college came from the Latin of collegium, which means as a unit. And then finally, Electoral College came into play in the 1800s. Basically, what happened is that the number of representatives that we have, which is 435, plus 100 senators, so that makes 535. And the idea is that you take the population and you divide it into 535. So every state is guaranteed of having at least 3 electors for the 2 senators and the 1 representative. And it can change. You know, Michigan is down to only 15 electors, where they were 16 in the last election. So basically, here's what it says, and I'll just read the first one to you. It says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. But no senator or representative or holding any office of trust shall be appointed elector. That's going to become very important in the election of 1876, as you're going to find out. Also, you would vote for separate candidates, and the candidates, more than one could be from a state. So for example, this year, Trump could not name Marco Rubio as a running mate because they're both from Florida. Harris could not name Gavin Newsom because they're both from California. So you have to be from 2 states. Okay. So again, it wasn't, don't fool yourself in modern terms. It's because you need to have, splitting the vote and having, different parts of the country represented. It's because back then they didn't want one state to have more power over the other. Okay. And also, the electors would not differentiate between the 2 people running. The person who got the most votes would be the president, and got the second number of votes would be vice president. Okay? We're going to see that could be a problem too. Okay? And if no candidate won a majority of the votes, then the House of Representatives would choose from the top vote getters. So you notice that the House of Representatives would choose it and not the Senate. Now remember, senators are elected to how much of a term? Who remembers? 6 years. Why? Because senators were sort of equivalent to the House of Lords. They were seen as the richer of the candidates, so they could be away from their homes or their businesses. Oh, also at this time, it wasn't a full-time legislature, part-time. And the House of Representatives were sort of like the House of the Peers, the House of the Common People. They were the farmers, the shopkeepers, so they could be away for 2 years. And they felt they more represented the common man. So that's why the power went to the House. Okay, so if your slide looks like this, and for those on Zoom, you'll see it's sort of a blue slide. It's because it's just a little anecdote here. In 5 presidential elections, 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016, the candidate that had the most popular vote did not win the presidency. It was the electoral vote. Okay. So let's go to the very first election. Election of 1789. Okay, this is 13 years after we were a nation. The first college convened. Now there were 13 colonies, right? But only 10 states cast votes. North Carolina and Rhode Island still 13 years later had not ratified the Constitution. And New York didn't send the electors, even though it was meeting in Philadelphia, which was, right around the corner. Okay. After the quorum was established, it took 2 months and they counted. George Washington was unanimously elected. He received all 69 electoral votes that were there. John Adams received 34 votes, and therefore he became vice president. And there were no political parties, as the framers did not want to have parties because they saw all the problems that the Brits had with the Whigs and the Tories and the Conservative and the Labor or whatever. If any of you have ever watched how the British do their conventions, it's really quite amazing. Our people would die. So let's say all the people right here in this row, from the lady in the purple, all the way down, let's say they were the candidates from HASP and they were running for office. On the day of the voting, after the ballots were counted, they'd make them stand up here in line and they'd say, Mary Smith, you received 42 votes, and John, you received 67. And that's how they, they sort of embarrassed these poor people who didn't get, any votes. We don't do it that way, but that's how it is. So I have a slide here just to show you. This is what the United States looked like back for the election. Here's the number of electoral votes based on the population. And we're not going to get into the part about the 3/5 and the slaves and things like that. All right. And you can see that Washington overwhelmingly got the most votes, followed by Adams and all these secondary candidates. I'll point out this one here, Robert H. Harrison. The only thing notable about him is he is the grandfather of our 9th president, William Henry Harrison, and the great-great-grandfather of our 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison. Okay, so this is how it went. Okay. Election of 1792, Washington didn't want to run again. He was in ill health, but he was convinced to run again because he said that they needed the stabilizing influence. There was no effort to unseat Washington, but now we get parties, and the Anti-Federalists did not like John Adams. So they tried to unseat him, but he still won enough votes to be elected. And look at 2 other names down here at the bottom who are going to take precedent next time: Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And again, this is how it looks. And look at here. Here's Ohio, but this right here, which is Tennessee, is now called the Ohio River Territory. Okay, and here's the north of the Ohio Territory, which is where Michigan is. Okay. So, 1796, Washington said, no, I'm done. He's out. So we have 2 parties for the first time. We have the Federalists, led by John Adams, and they identified against the Democratic Republicans led by Jefferson. And they had the French Revolution as a backdrop. And they said one favored slavery, one favored the monarchy. Neither candidate actively campaigned for office, leaving it to others, but they said, yes, I will serve. And when the votes were tallied, Adams narrowly defeated Jefferson. But it was the first time the president and the vice president were from 2 opposing parties. Can you imagine if you had a Trump waltz or a Harris Vance ticket? Okay. Okay, so here's a little anecdote. Friends of Adam and Jefferson, well, first of all, once friends, Adam and Jefferson did get along, and their allies were against each other. So here's what they said about Jefferson: a mean-spirited, low-lived fellow, the son of a half-breed Indian squaw, sired by a Virginia mulatto father, and in the attack warned in the consequences of a potential Jefferson presidency. Murder, robbery, rape, adultery, incest will be openly taught and practiced. The air will be rent with the cries of the distressed. The soil will be soaked with blood and the nation black with crimes. And this was in the newspapers. But not to be outdone, the Friends of Jefferson went back and forth. Now here's another one. This is under the Philadelphia Gazette, did 25 letters that attacked him. And under the pseudonym of Phocion, the letters did a systematic and bitterly argument against it. They questioned his philosophical treatment for office, charged him with harboring sympathies with the revolutionaries in France, accused him of hypocrisy and slavery, and even hinted at his now accepted relationship with Sally Hemings. Now, it's been discovered that the letters were written by Adams supporter William Lawton Smith, an arch Federalist of South Carolina. Those of you who may have read Ron Chernow's book about Alexander Hamilton, he claims Hamilton did that, but later research has actually proven it was written by Smith. Now, how about on Adams? John Callender, who didn't like Adams because Adams had prosecuted him against the Sedition Act, which basically was against freedom of speech by the press. He wrote that Adams was a rageful, lying, warmongering fellow, a repulsive pedant, a gross hypocrite who behaved neither like a man nor a woman, but instead possessed a hideous hermaphroditical character. I hope I don't have to explain to you what that last means. Okay. And so here was the election here. So you see, it was a little bit closer. He still had the majority of 71 to 68. As you can see now, where Alabama and Mississippi are, the Ohio River Territory has now moved south, and we have Tennessee. Okay. And Washington still got a couple of votes, but again, this is how everything broke out. Now, in the election of 1800, this was a doozy. They squared off again in a bitterly and hotly contested race. And it was the first time that political parties actually ran. So in 1796, even though they were affiliated with parties, they didn't run on a ticket. Now, Democratic Republicans, Jefferson and Burr, they ran on the same ticket, but they each received 73 votes. Remember, one of our first slides said that you voted for two people. Okay, you didn't differentiate between president and vice president. Federalists Adams and Charles Pinckney got 65 and 64. So what do you do in a tie? It went to the House. So most Federalist representatives backed Burr, and all the Democratic Republican representatives backed Jefferson. Okay. The former running mates now became rivals, and Burr actively campaigned for the office. So after 6 days and 36 ballots, Jefferson was declared the president-elect and Burr was declared vice president. Alexander Hamilton and the lame duck Federalists threw their support to Jefferson. The governors of Pennsylvania and Virginia threatened to call out the militia. Jefferson did not trust Burr as his running mate because he ran against him, and also felt that since Burr was really running as the vice president, he should have stepped aside and let Jefferson have it, but he did not do so. So Jefferson basically gave him nothing to do. Okay. And then Jefferson ran again in 1804. Now, Alexander Hamilton, who did finally throw his support to Jefferson, didn't care for Jefferson, but he said, there is no man in the world I should hate more than Thomas Jefferson, but at least he is honorable. Now, who remembers what happened to Alexander Hamilton and who did him in? Vice President Burr. Okay, so here was how this election went again. So now the Ohio River Territory has been split. And now we have Indiana Territory. And the Ohio River Territory has now become part of the Mississippi Territory. So you can see how that went. Okay. So when they discovered that we had a problem with Adam and Jefferson being two different parties, becoming president and vice president, and then you had a tie, what are you going to do? So they came up with something called the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. And it was proposed in 1803 and submitted to the states 3 days later. Now, for an amendment to be passed, 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. 14 of the 17 did, but Massachusetts never ratified it till 1861. I think they found it in an archive or something that had been sitting there for over 100 years. In the future, the electors would cast 2 votes. One would have to be a non-native from that person's state, but 1 vote would explicitly have to be for the presidency, and 1 vote would be for the vice president. The other changes is that if there was a tie, the House would choose the president from only the top 3 choices. The Senate would now choose the vice president from the top 2 choices. Still could be a problem, but it guaranteed there would always be a vice president, meaning a vice president to run and presumably take the reins in the event of an opening, and that the president and the vice president would be from the same party. Election of 1808, Charles Cotesworthy Pinckney ran and he lost, and he said, "I was beaten by Mr. Madison and Mrs. Madison. I would have had a better chance had I run against Mr. Madison alone." Just showing the power that Dolly Madison had and how she was perceived to be such a great person. So election of 1804, this is where we really start to get into our bitter campaigns. Again, the House elects a president. So the Federalist Party of Adams and Jefferson and Washington disappeared. All 4 candidates were now Democrat Republicans. Old Hickory Andrew Jackson, hero of the War of 1812, won the popular votes, but captured 99 electoral votes. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams took 84 votes. Treasury Secretary William Crawford had 41, even though he was decapitated, he had a stroke. Okay, and Speaker of the House Henry Clay took 37. 131 votes were needed. Okay, so again, you can see here, that was what the majority was needed, 131. So the election again went to the House of Representatives. So, and what happened is the state delegates would vote what's called en bloc, meaning they would vote together. So there were 24 states at the time, so 13 states had to give their vote. So you needed to have 13 to win. Clay was eliminated because remember, the 12th Amendment said only the top 3 could go. But he still controlled the House because he was the Speaker of the House. So even though the legislature of his home state of Kentucky said that they should vote for Jackson, because remember, Jackson's from Tennessee, they're right next to each other, Clay decides to vote for Adams, which means that his entire delegation of Kentucky followed and voted for Adams. So therefore, Adams wins. And 2 weeks later, Adams selects Henry Clay as Secretary of State. Well, Jackson cries out corruption and calls this the corrupt bargain. It's one of 2 presidential elections called the corrupt bargain. Furious, he resigns his Tennessee Senate seat and spent the next 4 years planning to run against and smash Adams. John Quincy Adams hated being president. He called it the 4 most miserable years of my life. Okay, He was hounded at every turn by Jackson and his supporters, and he had actually offered Jackson the cabinet position of Secretary of War, but he declined. After the presidency, he went on to become a senator. So here's what it looked like beforehand. So you could see what the electoral vote and the new map looked like beforehand. And then after, when they declared for Adams and Kentucky had switched its vote. So another interesting thing is John C. Calhoun in those days decided to run for vice president only. And they campaigned separately, but they were on the same ticket. He saw that his chances for winning the presidency were slim, but he thought he'd run for vice president. He's the only person that I found in all my research that actively wanted to be vice president. Okay. Despite not being on the same ticket as Adams, he won the vice presidency by a significant margin. Andrew Jackson, ironically, received 13 electoral votes to be vice president. So Calhoun disliked Adams' policies, but he did not like Henry Clay. So now you have 4 years later, John Quincy Adams is the president, sixth president, and Jackson is waiting in the wings, and everything that he and his people can do are against him. And now we have the first time of mudslinging comes up in a presidential campaign. By the time the votes were cast, both men had wild stories circulated about their past, including lurid charges of murder, adultery, and procuring of women plastered across the paper. Jackson actively campaigned. He was the first presidential candidate outside of Burr, but this was in a huge election. He actively campaigned, and Adams was an elitist because he was with wealthy shop owners, and he wrote letters attacking Adams. Here's just some of the things that Adams was accused of. He was accused of being a pimp while serving as a diplomat of Russia. Supposedly, he procured American women for the Tsar. Accused of being an elitist, accused of being a Yankee, attacked for having a billiards table in the White House. It wasn't the White House then, it was the executive mansion, accused of being a spendthrift and accused of advocating votes for free blacks. Neither of these last two were correct. How about Jackson? He did have an incendiary temper. He did fight enormous amount of duels, and he actually killed somebody in 1806. He's accused of being murderer, ordering the execution of 6 militia members accused of desertion. That was our very first slide, where the coffin campaign, that these guys had deserted and he had them executed. He was accused of adultery and his wife of bigamy for running off with another man's wife, which isn't really true. So the story was that Rachel Donaldson had been separated from her husband for a number of years, and she was procuring a divorce from her husband. After 3 years, she thought she had the divorce. So 5 years later, she marries Andrew Jackson. Well, once Jackson started running for office, surprise, he did not get the divorce, even though he told her they did. Finally, they were able to get a divorce and they got remarried, but they called her an adulterer, called her a bigamist, but it wasn't her intention because she had gone through the steps, and her husband is the one that fell through. How about this one? He accused of being a cannibal, murdering 500 Indians and having his men eat them. Not true. They did kill the Indians, but they didn't eat them. Okay. And accused of being a mulatto, and his mother was a prostitute. Again, that was one of the big things, to accuse somebody's mother of wrongdoing. Okay, so again, this is the new election, and he just creamed Adams in the election, won. Okay. Now, setting a precedent, Jackson refused to attend the inaugural and to visit with, Jackson refused to visit with the outgoing president, so therefore Adams refused to attend the inauguration ceremony. So let's skip ahead a little bit till 1836. Now we have a new party called the Whig Party, founded by Daniel Webster, and they hated Jackson, and they could not agree on a candidate to run against his vice president, Martin Van Buren. So they decided, let's ran 4 candidates, and hoping that each of these would get enough electoral votes to prevent Van Buren from winning, but he beat them all. So he ran Willie Mangum, Hugh White, Daniel Webster, and William Henry Harrison. So here was this election, and as you can see, Mangum only got 1 state. Now the Whigs portrayed Martin Van Buren as a effete snob with a penchant for nice perfume and strutting in front of a $2,400 mirror like a peacock. History shows he's actually the lowest spending president as far as White House expenditures. But here's the one I loved. A Pennsylvania congressman accused Van Buren of being so decadent that he would landscape the White House grounds into hills resembling an Amazon's bosom. Okay, let's skip ahead to 1844. James K. Polk, who was a very somber Methodist. There was actually no balls during his 4 years in office, no drinking. His loyalists accused Henry Clay had sex with whores and furthermore broke all 10 of the commandments. In lieu of evidence, they just declared that the details were too disgusting to appear in public print. Maybe we should do that. Oh, they did that. Okay. So the gentleman on the left, as you see, is Lewis Cass. He's from Michigan. And the Whig called him a pot-bellied, mutton-headed cucumber in response to accusation that opposing Zachary Taylor. And Taylor, they said, was a crappy dresser. Election of 1856 is one of the most bitter and contentious campaigns. I don't know, maybe 2024 we'll get in there, but before that, I want to give you a little bit of a history lesson. You may remember some of these things back when I always say it, I tell my kids the dark ages when I went to school. In 1820, there was what was called the Missouri Compromise, and it established a boundary by which slave states were in the Union. So whether slavery was permitted up against the state. So then in 1854, Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas decided the popular sovereignty, meaning the direct election by the people or the direct vote of the people, by which means Nebraska and Kansas would decide whether they would enter the Union as a slave or a free state. Supporters on both sides poured into Kansas, advocating their side, revolting in a number of violent clashes. And this was what was called Bleeding Kansas. Pro-slavery forces set fire to the town of Lawrence, Kansas, their homes, stores, and hotels. Abolitionist John Brown and his company dragged 5 men from their homes in Pottawatomie Creek and brutally killed them in retaliation. They quickly left to go to Virginia. I like this one. Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, beat Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts with his cane on the floor in response to a speech denouncing supporters of slavery. And Kansas adopted the Free State Constitution in 1859. And only after the Confederates succeeded did Congress approve. And Kansas entered the Union in January of 1861. So they had the Constitution in 1859, only after the states succeeded in November of 1860, and then 2 months later, they gave it a free state. Now, the Whig Party in 1856 was in a state of collapse. They formed two new parties, the Know-Nothings, because if you'd ask them what their platform was, they didn't know. Okay. And the Republicans, who opposed slavery. Incumbent President Franklin Pierce was a Democrat, but he lost the primary. He wanted to seek re-election. And instead, the Democrats nominated Pennsylvanian and Minister to Great Britain, James Buchanan. Buchanan campaigned to promise to maintain the status quo, slavery in the South, freedom in the North. Democrats painted the Republicans as hotbeds of radicals and disunion. They warned the Republicans' extreme stance will cause a civil war between the North and the South. The Republicans nominated dashing explorer and the first senator from the new state of California, John C. Fremont. This was the first time the Republican Party ran a candidate. Their platform denied the authority of Congress and the legislatures to give legal existence to slavery. Their slogans were free speech, free soil, and Fremont. The Know-Nothings nominated former President Millard Fillmore. Their platform was very xenophobic, and basically it was just there to defeat the Democrats. Sparks flew on all sides. The Democrats called Fremont a Catholic, a drunkard, a bastard, and a black abolitionist. Okay. Fremont did not receive one vote south of the Mason-Dixon line. Okay. So you could see the Republicans did not fare well. And now you could see how the country looked back in 1856. Okay. The election of 1860, we saw 4 candidates run. Fledgling politician Abraham Lincoln of Illinois was the nominee of the Republican Party, who were steadfast opponents of slavery. He was also sort of the sacrificial lamb, because this was a new party and nobody had ever heard of Lincoln. Okay. The Democrats had a convention and there was no candidate. They couldn't agree on one because there was a split in the party over slavery. So the second convention selected Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Remember, he was the one that worked on the Kansas-Nebraska compromise. And also he was famous because in 1858, he debated Congressman Abraham Lincoln on the issue of slavery in Illinois. Well, the Southern Democrats didn't like that, so they broke away and they nominated sitting Vice President John Breckinridge. Both claimed to be the official nominee of the Democratic Party. And then there was the Constitution Party, who nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Lincoln won 40% of the popular vote, but the majority of the electoral votes. Douglas won 30% of the popular vote, but only 12 electoral votes. Look at this. Breckinridge didn't have that much of the popular, but he had 72 electoral votes. And Bell won 13% and 39. So Stephen Douglas, who was more well-known of any of these candidates, only got 12 electoral votes. Again, Lincoln did not get any votes in the states south of the Mason-Dixon line, with the exception of Virginia, where he got 1%. In many southern states, he wasn't even on the ballot. By the time of his inauguration in March, 7 southern states had already succeeded. Now, in those days, you got to remember they didn't have the instant notification, and there really wasn't a election day. There was an election week where people could come in and vote. So the voting was done the first couple of weeks in November. And by the time they counted all the votes, and then it went to the state legislators, and then they went to Washington, it wasn't until March. Okay, it wasn't until Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 that they moved it to January. Okay, so this is how the country looked back in 1860. Douglas accused Lincoln of being a drunk, stating he could ruin more liquor than all the boys in town altogether. In June 1860, the New York Tribune, the Republicans claimed the Democrats formed the rendezvous of thieves, the home of parasites and bloodsuckers, the enemy of God and man, the stereotyped fraud, the sham, the hypocrite, the merciless marauder, and the outlaw, renegade, and benefactor. Okay. Douglas is compared to an obstinate animal, adding, I mean no disrespect. Bell is characterized as nobody's man who stands on nobody's platform. Okay, a Democrat, I like this one. A Democratic newspaper in Pennsylvania explained the truth of why Lincoln emigrated to Illinois. Old Abe's extreme ugliness has been remarked by all who have seen him or his picture. At length, the slaveholders resolved that they would no longer submit to the scaring away of their servants. And Lincoln was advised to go to Illinois, where his ugliness might be turned to a good account in scaring away the wolves. In actuality, Lincoln was born in Kentucky, and when he was 9 years old, they moved to Illinois. And remember, in 1861 is when he grew the beard, because a little girl named Grace Bedell sent him a letter saying she thought he would look better with the beard. Okay. In the election of 1872, Ulysses Grant was running for his second term against Democrat Horace Greeley. Remember him? Go West, young man. Greeley died on November 29th before the electoral votes were counted. The only candidate to die before the election was certified. So at that point, it didn't matter because Grant was leading, but and the electors committed to him voted for others. Just think about that. He couldn't have won because he wasn't alive, and that could have thrown the whole thing off. Just imagine if the awful had happened to this summer. You know, who would be the candidate? You know, would they do a new convention or what? It was crazy. Greeley was also a very interesting person. The circumstances of his death are still widely unknown. He died in a mental hospital. His wife had passed away, and he just did not do well. His wife died during the campaign. He did not do well, and his family sent him to a hospital to recover, and then he just died, not from mental illness, but that's what they did. They sent people to mental hospitals in those days. Here we go. The Detroit Free Press published comments about Grant that they attributed to leading radicals. Grant is a drunkard. He is a man of vile habits and no ideas. I'm going to Europe to get out of this advocating bungler. How many times have we heard celebrities saying they're going to move to a different country if so-and-so is elected? I don't think anybody has ever moved. Have you ever heard of anybody moving? Wasn't Rosie O'Donnell going to move to England or Canada or someplace? Okay. Never ask me to support a twaddler and a trimmer. I don't know what those meant. The nation owes it to its self-respect to tolerate imbecility in politics no longer. Grant is as brainless as his saddle. Grant did not have a very good presidency, by the way. It was loaded with graft. Okay. The election of 1876. On the left, you have Samuel J. Tilden. On the right, you have Rutherford B. Hayes. Tilden won 250,000 more votes than his Republican opponent Hayes. And he also had more electoral votes, but was one shy of the 185 needed. The votes were too close to call in Florida. Sound familiar? Louisiana and South Carolina. That's what I'm afraid of this year. Those poor people in North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, are they going to be able to get to the polling places? Okay. And one Oregon elector was declared should be ineligible, should be together, not separated like that, as he was a government employee. Remember that from an earlier slide where you could not be a congressman or representative or the employee of the government. So Congress decided, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a 15-member commission to decide upon it. Senators, congressmen, and Supreme Court justices. 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and an independent. So the Democrats said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take that independent Supreme Court Justice, David Davis. We have an open Senate seat. Let's appoint him to that Senate seat, thinking that he'd accept the seat, but he wouldn't resign his Supreme Court seat and that he would vote as a Democrat. Well, Davis did accept the seat, but he promptly resigned his Supreme Court seat. So then they had to appoint somebody else. The Republicans, who were in the majority, appointed Joseph Bradley to fill the seats because there were no more Democrats, there were no more independents in the Supreme Court. So Bradley was a Republican and he voted for Hayes and the election was decided. And of course, another civil war was threatened. You've heard the expression, the smoke-filled room. Well, here's what happened. The Democrats cried foul and claims. So they finally capitulated and they received a final agreement. And here's what they decided. And this has had implications to this day. Federal troops were removed from all Southern State House property. Okay? Funds will be provided to build the Texas and Pacific Railroad. A Southerner will be appointed as Postmaster General. I didn't realize that was such a prestigious seat. Funds will be appropriated to rebuild the economy in the South. And here we go. The solution to the race problem would be left to state governments. How many times have we heard something else be throwing to the state governments and people having a problem? This compromise consolidated the Democratic control of the South, ending Reconstruction and reversing the gains that African Americans made during the post-Civil War era. Okay. So here's on the one side is what the election looked like before, on the other side after the disputed election. How about this one? Grover Cleveland, to date, is the only man who has been elected president with 2 non-consecutive terms. He ran 3 times for office, 1884, 1888, and 1892. And all 3 times that he ran, he got the popular vote, but the time in between, 1888, he did not have the electoral vote. So he was supposedly supporting a woman he fathered with whom he wasn't married. And so his enemies distilled the story into a taunt. Ma, where's my pa? To which his supporters said, gone to the White House. Ha, ha, ha. Right? The next disputed one was the election of 1912. 4 candidates ran for office. Incumbent William Howard Taft ran on the Republican ticket. Governor Thomas Woodrow Wilson of New Jersey was the Democrat. Former former president, Theodore Roosevelt, ran on the Bull Moose ticket. And Eugene B. Debs ran on the socialist ticket. Wilson called his platform the New Freedom. He was going to destroy monopolies, open the doors of economic opportunity. We've heard that before, to small businessmen through drastic tariff reductions. We've heard of that. Banking reform and tightening of antitrust laws. Debs, who ran 5 times, the latter 1920 from jail, ran on a platform of rejecting capitalism, labor reforms, suffrage for all, direct election, but president by the people, and collective ownership of patents and companies. Means like if you designed this thing and you had a patent on it. Yeah, like a patent, yeah. Okay, now Roosevelt felt Taft betrayed him because he chose not to run for re-election in 1908, and he felt that he handed Taft the presidency. Taft did not support all of TR's policies, but what Taft did support was the creation of a Federal Trade Commission, a minimum wage, workman's comp, child labor laws, government pension for retirees. Excuse me, this is TR. He wanted the Federal Trade Commission, the minimum wage, workers' comp, child labor, government pension, fund to assist with health care costs, and women's suffrage. Okay. Taft was a little bit more conservative. He wanted to do it on constitutional forms. He was a lawyer. Matter of fact, after he was president no longer, he was appointed to the Supreme Court, which he was happier. He supported trust busting, FDA regulation, labor reform, tariff reform, a strong merchant marine fleet, conservation, and banking reforms. Well, by 1912, Taft basically gave up, saying there are so many people in the country who don't like me. And then 6 days before the election, his vice president died while in office. So Sherman also was the first vice president that had been renominated as vice president since 1828. He died of a stroke, by the way. So Nicholas Murray Butler was named to receive his electoral votes. Teddy traveled over 100,000 miles and 34 states in an active campaign. And in Milwaukee, he was delivering a speech and somebody shot him. The bullet pierced his chest, but it hit his glass case, and the bullet was actually embedded in his glass case. But he finished his 90-minute speech anyway, and then he went to the hospital. Wilson won over the split in the Republican Party. Taft finished 3rd. It was the first time that the majority a major party candidate did not finish in the top 2. And Debs received no electoral votes, but 6% of the popular vote. So this is how it looked. So here's a fun one. The election of 1916. Charles Evan Hughes went to bed on election night believing he had won. However, when the vote finally came in from California, Wilson was actually reelected. Reporters went to Hughes' home in the morning to get his reaction. They were told the president-elect is resting, to which they replied, tell him he ain't president no more. And look, the papers even said Hughes is elected president. Who can forget the famous election of 1948 with the famous headline of Dewey beats Truman? Okay, why was that headline? Because there was a 4-way split in the democratic process, again, over the civil rights and the blacks. And Democratic Party, including Senator Strom Thurmond, ran on the Dixiecrat ticket. Even Truman didn't think he had a chance. Okay, the election of 1960, the first 50-state battle. right? John Kennedy was 43 and Richard Nixon was only 46. So we have youth. Television for the first time was key to letting voters know who the candidates were and their policies. The televised debate was watched by 70 million, and those who watched it on TV gave the win to Kennedy. Those who listened on the radio gave it to Nixon. Now remember what happened. Kennedy had makeup on, he looked nice and bigger. Nixon, who decided he had to campaign in all 50 states, was haggard, and just the night before, he had badly hit his knee on something. He fell and really messed up his knee. So he was in a lot of pain. So that's why he was sweaty and haggard looking. Okay. Kennedy strategically focused on campaigning in the swing states. When's the last time you heard somebody campaigning in the Dakotas? Okay. Or Oklahoma. Okay. And Nixon exhausted time and resources in all 50. Okay. Kennedy emphasized his youth. Now remember, the previous president was Dwight Eisenhower, and at the time he was 69, which was old in those days. Okay. While Nixon focused on all his experiences, because Nixon was in his late 30s when he was appointed vice president. Okay. Election night was wild as it was declared to Kennedy and then to Nixon, and the same thing for California. It was declared for Kennedy and then it went to Nixon. And it was the first time the candidate won while carrying fewer states than the other candidate. Kennedy won by just 112,000 votes after 68 million cast. Look at that, 0.2%. An argument still persists to this day about vote counting in 2 states, Illinois, where he won by 9,000 votes, and he told his dad, don't buy more votes than they needed, okay? And Texas, where he won by 4,600 votes, okay? And remember, his running mate was Lyndon Johnson, and they called him landslide Lyndon because in one of his elections, it had been proven that they had stuffed the ballot boxes. If Nixon had won just those 2 states, he would have defeated Kennedy and won the vote in the Electoral College. Okay. I'm going to show you something now that was only run once. It was a negative campaign ad. And it was only run once in the election. And there was such negative reviews of it that all they could stand was to run it once. Maybe. Here we go.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
This little girl's 3.
Eight, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Harold. These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
People on both sides were sort of aghast at the nuclear
This has been
idea.
a presentation of the Library of Congress.
Thank you.
Visit us at loc.gov.
So they just couldn't believe it. And as I said, it only ran once. It never mentioned Goldwater by name, but the Democrats did have a saying, in your guts, you know, he's nuts, okay? But it was devastating, but Goldwater was already far behind in the polls. Okay, now one that we all remember. The hanging chads. The race pitted Democratic Vice President Al Gore versus Republican Governor George W. Bush. On election night, no clear winner emerged. Print and broadcast media cited often contradictory exit poll numbers. Remember, they all had to be first. Who's going to be the first one to announce? The races in Oregon and Mexico remained too close. Ultimately, the contest focused on Florida. The networks, I was telling my friends at lunch, the networks initially declared Gore the winner in Florida. I said, okay, he won, so I went to bed. Okay. Well, no. Then they declared Bush had a lead, an insurmountable lead. See that? For those of you on Zoom, I'm pointing out the word insurmountable. Okay. So Gore called Bush to concede the election. But wait, in the early hours, it became apparent that the race was too close and fewer than 600 insurmountable votes separated the candidates. So at 3 o'clock, Gore called a stunned Bush and said, I'm taking it back. Okay. So Florida law mandated a statewide machine recount. And finished on the 10th, Bush had another insurmountable 327 vote lead. So the court challenges were issued over the legality of the recounts. So we had the hanging chads. Was it improperly punched paper ballots? Or were you a pregnant chad, meaning that you were dimpled, but not all the way through? Were you overvotes? Did you vote for more than one person for the same office? Or undervote, where there was no vote for a given office? Remember like seeing the pictures of these guys doing that? I just thought that was pretty wild. To compound it, Palm Beach County Supervisor, that's where Mar-a-Lago is, aimed to help the elderly votes to read the ballots by making the type bigger and spreading the names over 2 pages. Now, for you on Zoom, I'm pointing out to you, at the very top, you have here the Republican George Bush, and that will be the first little dot. That's where you would punch, okay? Now, if you were doing Al Gore, you actually would be pushing right here in the 3rd dot. But people push the 2nd dot thinking, well, if the Republicans are at the top, the Democrats have to be next. I have no idea what this 1357 is. It must be something up here. But here the reform candidate, Pat Buchanan, was number 4. So he was in the middle. So they were trying to claim that, oh no, people were actually voting here in number 3. They wanted to vote for Gore, but because this thing was so messed up, they were printing number 2, which was Pat Buchanan. I don't know. Wow. So, and they said either the ballots were spoiled or they double marked. So now Florida declared Bush the winner by 537. Gore sued. The Supreme Court in Florida ordered a statewide manual recount of the undervotes in Palm Beach and Miami-Dade. So now Bush is ahead by that insurmountable 154 votes. And the Bush campaign quickly appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, asking it to delay the recounts until it could hear the case. But 3 days later, the Supreme Court said that a fair recount could not be done in time to meet the December 18 deadline. That was the deadline to certifying the votes. We all remember January 6th. That was the day they were certifying the votes. In 2000, it was December 18, and the Supreme Court said we could not do a recount by then. So in a 5-4 decision, they reversed Florida's recount, giving the presidency to Bush. Bush narrowly won 271 to 261, only one more than required, and one Gore elector abstained. but Gore did have the popular vote. Okay. Election of 2020. We all remember this. So Joe Biden ran on the Democratic ticket. There were 29 candidates because this was an open seat. They had Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Tulsi Gabbard, Michael Bloomberg. I think Michael Bloomberg sent something like over $1 million for every vote that he got. And Pete Buttigieg. After losing Iowa, Nevada, and New Hampshire, Biden won South Carolina primarily due to the endorsement of Representative James Clyburn. Right after that, that was on a Saturday, and then fall into place real quick was Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar and Elizabeth Warren, Super Tuesday, and he captured the votes. Donald Trump had minimal competition and became the presumptive nominee. Well, the issues were COVID-19, civil unrest due to the murder of George Floyd, the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, and the future of the Affordable Care Act. The election night ended without a clear winner, as many states were too close to call, and millions of votes remain uncounted, including, and does this sound familiar? The battleground states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Biden was declared the winner, but Trump refused to concede, claiming voter fraud and stuffed ballots. Just 44,000 votes in those 3 votes separated Biden and Trump. Trump and his team sued numerous states to get elected, to overturn it, but to no avail. When the day of certification on January 6th, Trump held a rally and supporters, they stormed the Capitol was stormed, and later that evening, the vote was stemmed. So here's Trump giving his speech and some of the supporters. You remember this guy with the buffalo head. Okay. A good friend of mine actually went to this rally. He asked me to go. I said, "You crazy? I'm not going to Washington in January." But he said that he remembers looking at his watch for some reason, and I don't know what it was, 1:30 or something. And he said Trump was still speaking, and the majority of the crowd was there at 1:30. And then when he gets home and sees all the big hullabaloo at the time that the storming of the Capitol occurred, it was 1:30, and most of the crowd is there. So again, I'm not advocating either way, but who knows? But anyways, it's over. It's still ramifications are going. And here was how the election appeared out. Again, look, in the middle of the country is where you have all of the Republican votes, and it's the 2 coasts. Now we got the election of 2024. Biden out. Bobby Kennedy out. So you have Trump and Kamala. So Trump won the Republican nomination over Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, and Vivek Ramaswamy. Joe Biden had minimal competition and easily wins renomination. Now, traditionally, you have the Iowa caucuses and you have the New Hampshire primary, and they're first. Well, to reward South Carolina for supporting Biden in 2020, they moved South Carolina first. So the Republicans alone did the Iowa caucuses and they did the New Hampshire primary. Biden received 14 million votes, which was 87%, and he confirms Kamala Harris as his vice president. Robert Kennedy Jr. ran as a Democrat, but they wouldn't even let him in on the ballot in some of these places. So he left the party and ran as an independent under the New Law Party. And then, as you know, he dropped out. And then in June 27th, the debate was held between Trump and Biden. It was the Biden campaign who wanted to have an early debate. The candidates were asked a total of 20 questions. The viewers, including Trump himself and Democratic elites, were surprised by Biden's poor performance. The early reports of Biden's mental decline resurfaced. The next day, polls showed 60% were in favor of replacing Biden. And he finally withdrew on July 21, endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris. So then you have Butler, PA. Then you have September 10, the debate. Then you have West Palm Beach. And then last week, we had the vice presidential debate. So here we are. Who's running in Michigan? So this is my absentee ballot. You know, when you're old, they automatically send you an absentee ballot. So here is running, and notice what it says. It doesn't say who you are voting for president. It says, and for the people on Zoom, I'm pointing to the second line, electors of president and vice president of the United States. So on the Democratic, you have Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, Donald J. Trump, J.D. Vance, Chase Oliver, never heard of him, Randall Terry, Jill Stein for the Green Party. Bobby Kennedy unsuccessfully tried to get himself off of the Michigan ballot. Joseph Kinshore and Cornel West. Cornel West was that controversial professor from Harvard, and they're running on a no party ticket, which I think that's pretty interesting. Okay, so when you go and cast your ballot, this is what you will see. And again, you are voting for the electors. You are not voting for the candidate. And you have no idea who they are. So here's how we shape out. You need 270 votes to win. So people on Zoom, look at your lower left-hand corner. Here are the number of electoral votes per state. So looking over here on the far right, California, you know that's going to go to Harris. So she's already got 54 votes. Texas will probably go to Trump. So he's got 40. Then you got Florida, New York, and Illinois will both go to Harris. Florida will probably go to Trump. Then you've got your battleground states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia, Michigan, Virginia, Washington, Wisconsin is at 11. So if they only campaigned in those 12 states, they could do it. Like I said, when's the last time you heard somebody going to Oklahoma or Kansas or Nebraska? Now, Nebraska is interesting. This is Nebraska right in the middle with 6 votes. They have 5 electors who vote the way the state did. So if you have George Washington running in Nebraska against John Adams, 5 of the electors have to vote as to whoever got the most votes. So let's say that's Washington. That other elector is free to choose to vote for Washington or to vote for Adams. Same thing happens up here in Maine. There's also an elector in Maine that can do the same thing. It's their state law. So who knows what's going to happen? I think we're in a wild ride. I'm sorry, I keep messing you up. We have 29 days to go. I don't think they will be quiet days. I will be glad to get my TV back after seeing ad after ad after ad. You know, you see an ad for Trump and then an ad for Harris, an ad for Slotkin, an ad for Russ, you know, for Rogers, an ad, you know, it's just crazy. So there are the wild elections of the 59 elections that we've had in the US. So I hope you've enjoyed, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that you have. Okay. So we have a question here in the front.
Are any of the states on a pro rata basis, or are they all winner, they all,
It's winner take all. for
winner
most of
take
them.
all in all the states.
For
except
most of them.
Are there, but there are none that are pro rata?
They are supposed to vote pro rata, but you do have in some elections, people will, if they are vehemently opposed to a candidate for some reason, we have had that happen. But the majority of the electors do go with whoever their party, whoever is supported, because the electors are elected by the party. So either by the Democratic Party or by the Republican Party. And if they want to be in good in the future with their party, they will stay. Okay, yes.
I know we've had attempts in the past to do away with the Electoral College. Why do we still have such an antiquated system?
I think, for example, of just what we saw here, even though today it seems like it, they would only go to California, to New York, to Texas, to Illinois, to go to the states with the most population and go there and try to win the election through the direct popular vote. The Electoral College at least gives some sort of semblance of fairness so that your smaller states could make a difference. So let's go in here. Let's say that Washington is out. So that gives you 267. So you still need 3 votes. And if they know that's going to happen, they could go to some place like Delaware, or the Dakotas, or to Montana and try to get those votes. Although the Republicans are making a play for Montana this year, they do think that they have a good chance with the guy running against John Tester for Senate. Because you got to remember, yes, we are electing a president, but we are also electing 435 members of the House of Representatives, and we're also electing 33 new senators. Okay, and who controls the purse strings? Congress. So you want to get your majority in either in the House or in the Senate so that you can get your judicial candidates approved, you can get your bills approved. So I think that's why we still have the Electoral College. Okay, any other questions?
Any other questions? Okay.
Yes, here.
Oh,
We have one right here.
Do you know how they choose the order to list on the ballot?
I do not. That is interesting also.
Because it
I-
seems like there's some advantage to being listed first. I saw Harris was on the ballot on your sample ballot first.
I think in the presidential, they do it by alphabet, D for Democrat, R for Republican, but it does make a difference for the down ballots. So for example, in the precinct that I'm in, we've got like 5 people running for county commissioner. I don't know, and I say some people might just vote for number 1 or number 3. I don't know. But I do know sometimes they mix those up because I know my mother's had an absentee ballot and she had different down ballot order than I did. So hopefully it's fair that way.
there's a question over there.
But I do hope no matter what it is, you do go out and vote. Yes.
Do you know historically if we've ever had candidates that are convicted felons?
We have had people that were accused of things as far as a convicted felon with Trump. No, not to that degree, but nothing in the requirement says that you have to be. It says that you can't vote. If you're in prison or in a felon for some races in some states, but no. Huh? Florida does not have that rule. Some states do have the rule.
Any more questions? Okay, let's thank our presenter.
Okay,
Lu
well, thank
Paletta.
you.
Thank you.
Mhm.